Irenaeus tells us that John's Gospel was written while John was resident at Ephesus in Asia Minor, which is very close geographically to Smyrna, which is where Polycarp was from. And Irenaeus tells us that Polycarp was his mentor, and Polycarp himself was mentored by John the Apostle. And so do you think that that would be an argument for Johannine authorship, given that Irenaeus was probably in a position to know, being closely acquainted with an associate of John himself, and also the fact that Polycarp, in his only surviving epistle, his epistle to the Philippian church, he actually quotes from the Johannine epistles, and there's strong literary and thematic parallels between the Johannine epistles and John's Gospel, suggesting a commonality of authorship. You think that if the Johannine epistles were forgeries, Polycarp, of all people, would know about it. Do you think that's a persuasive argument for Johannine authorship?
Yeah, I think it could be. I mean, I don't know that it's conclusive. None of the kind of arguments that you give, I'm not saying you, but none of the arguments that any of us can give are airtight. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or atheism. There are no airtight arguments. So we have to go by probability on something like this. And I'm convinced of Johannine authorship of the Gospel of John and at least First John. When I am convinced by the arguments that are given by people like Craig Keener and Craig Blomberg. I'm more persuaded by their arguments that John wrote the Gospel than someone else. I'm more persuaded by their arguments than, say, Richard Bauckham's argument that John the Elder wrote John's Gospel. Now you're saying, well, yeah, but Mike, you're an evangelical. Of course you're going to do that. Well, you could say that, I suppose, but I'm not so persuaded about the authorship of Matthew, to be honest with you. But I do think the arguments for John's Gospel, Johannine authorship, are very strong, right. Better than the others. And as I read John, I've read John's Gospel 8 times in Greek, and I've read First John. Well, I've read all the Gospels 8 times in Greek, and I've read First John a dozen times in Greek. And it's amazing when you read them in Greek, and when you look at First John and John, there's no question in my mind that it's written by the same author. The vocabulary, the style are strikingly similar. Second John and Third John, that's quite difficult. I don't know about whether John wrote those. He could have, maybe there was a scribe or someone who helped him there, or a different scribe who was involved. I don't know, but it's different than it is with First John and John.
It's also interesting that you get this convergence between the external and internal evidence for Johannine authorship of John's Gospel, because with the internal evidence, you have to do some detective work to work out, who is the disciple whom Jesus loved, because he doesn't self-identify by the name John. Whereas the Johannine epistles do self-identify by the name John, and you find the strong literary and thematic parallels between them. And then you have the early church attestation to Johannine authorship, so you have the internal and external evidence. You would think that if John's Gospel was trying to pass itself off as Johannine, it would be far more emphatic and explicit about its authorship than simply leaving it to our detective work.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Jonathan. And, I don't know how to explain it except just to say that all of the Gospels in that sense are anonymous. And, we can only guess why none of them identified themselves. None of them identified themselves. Now, the early church tradition was, pretty much unanimous on who wrote the Gospels. There's really no disagreement, except for John. There was maybe 1 or 2 sources who said it wasn't John the Apostle. But other than that, everything else is unanimous. It was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think that the unanimous early church tradition has to be taken into consideration. But I think the arguments you gave for the Johannine authorship of the epistles and John's Gospel, I think are pretty strong. I do find them persuasive.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting also that in the early 2nd century, the Gospels are quoted by the early church fathers without names being attached to them. It's only in the mid to late 2nd century that you have names attached to them, which suggests that the early 2nd century writers understood their audience to already be acquainted with those documents and consider them to be authoritative. And if there was much controversy and debate in the early 2nd century, you would expect that to be reflected in the mid to late 2nd century when names are attached to them by Tertullian of Carthage, by Irenaeus of Lyon, by Papias of Hierapolis, by Clement of Alexandria, and especially in view of the wide geographical spread, Egypt, North Africa, France, Asia Minor. attesting to the traditional authorships, that uniformity of tradition seems to suggest a very early, primitive, and monolithic tradition. And especially since Luke also has a strong case for being written by Luke, because it was certainly written by a traveling companion of Paul. We know that because Acts has very strong evidence that it was written by an eyewitness, and very strong evidence that it was written by a traveling companion of Paul because of the we statements in the latter half of the book. And then Mark has a very strong case, I would argue, because Justin Martyr refers to the so-called Memoirs of Peter in his dialogue with Trypho, and we're told in his first apology that the Memoirs of the Apostles are also Gospels, and the Memoirs of Peter, he tells us, have two incidents. The sons of Zebedee are called the sons of thunder, Boanerges, and Simon is called Peter, but neither of those is in the Gospel of Peter, but both are in Mark, and the Boanerges, sons of Zebedee incident is only in Mark, which suggests we're dealing with Mark. But why would it go from calling it the Memoirs of Peter to the Gospel of Mark unless Mark was the author? That doesn't seem to make much sense, because Mark was a far more minor character than Peter, and is best known for having abandoned Paul in Pamphylia and causing the split between Paul and Barnabas. Matthew, I think, is the weakest of the four Gospels in terms of his authorship. You could argue that, well, it was written by a tax collector who were seen as being traitors by the Jews, but then why is it so literally dependent upon Mark? So I think Matthew's the weakest, but I think certainly for Mark, Luke, and John, you have a very compelling argument.
Yep, I agree with you.
And
the fact that they're anonymous too, that doesn't bother me, because as I have studied Plutarch over the last several years, I came to notice that Plutarch's name doesn't appear in any of them. Nowhere in the 50 biographies written by Plutarch does his name appear. They're all anonymous. If you look at the writings of Plato, they're anonymous. If you look at the writings of Porphyry, anonymous.
Clement of Rome.
Anonymous.
Clement of Rome was anonymous as well.
Clement of Rome?
Yeah, he isn't itself an Yeah, Irenaeus tells us that Clement of Rome wrote the epistle to the Corinthian church, but he doesn't. And then he describes the contents of the letter, which resemble Clement of Rome. So that's how we know that he wrote it, but he doesn't. And Hebrews obviously is anonymous as well.